Hi, I'm John with Seaflush. In this video, we put together the full story of what it takes to winterize a boat. Everyone has their own techniques, and these are the ones I used as a mechanic to quickly and effectively winterize boats. The boat in this video is a 37 Chris Craft with 2 engines, a generator, 2 AC units, a freshwater system, and 2 heads. I would charge about $700 to winterize this boat while spending about $150 on materials. And typically, I would be on and off the boat in about 2 hours. Take a look at the video and see how I do it.
When first arriving at the boat, I start by adding fuel stabilizer to the gas tank and then going inside to turn on the blower. Down in the engine room, I check the engine's oil level and coolant level in the heat exchanger. Then I check the generator's oil and coolant also. If it's tough to look into the heat exchanger, you can dip a paper towel into the opening to check the antifreeze level. It's also worth mentioning that you can test the freeze point of the antifreeze with a hydrometer. With the fluids checked, it's now time to start the generator and the engines to bring them up to temperature to do the oil changes. Engine oil changes are typically done in the fall so that the engine is laid up through the winter with clean oil. With the oil warmed up, it can easily be drawn out through the dipstick using a topside oil pump. After about a quart has been drained, I draw off a sample for oil analysis. More on this later. As the rest of the oil is being pumped out, I remove the oil filter, being careful not to make a mess. Not bad. Always make sure the gasket is on the filter and not still stuck on the engine. With oil filters that screw on from the bottom up, I always pre-fill them with oil so that when you start the engine, the oil pump doesn't have to fill the filter with oil before having that oil go on to circulate the engine. Yes, this oil is actually purple. It's Royal Purple's marine grade full synthetic engine oil. In gathering materials to shoot this video, a Fram oil filter was used instead of a Wix. I later went back to the Wix filter, but I have to admit, I do like the black grip surface on the bottom of a Fram filter. I wish I had invented that. With all the oil drained, I switch the pump over to the other engine and add new oil to this engine. Because I pre-filled the oil filter, I can add oil exactly to the full line on the dipstick. If the oil filter isn't pre-filled, I initially take the oil level slightly higher than the full mark on the dipstick, as some of it will be pumped into the oil filter. After changing the oil and filter on the other engine, I start both engines to circulate the clean oil. Lastly, I verify the oil level on the dipstick. These are the results of the oil analysis for the starboard engine. I won't go into too much detail in this video, but the main thing to look for is that the presence of antifreeze, fuel, and water all tested negative. There's also no high levels of metal in the oil other than copper and silicon, which are a normal part of the break-in procedure. These engines only have 200 hours on them. This boat will be staying in the water this winter, so I'm going to use every step of the Seaflush method to winterize the engines. I start by closing the seacock, opening the strainer lid, and removing the strainer basket. It's not necessary, but for demonstration purposes, I use a shop vac to draw the raw water out of the sea strainer. Since I'll be using the Seaflush snorkel hose to draw antifreeze out of a bucket, I start by making the paper towel gasket and laying it over the strainer opening. I then set the Seaflush reservoir in place and use the bungee cords to secure it. At this point, I want to clear the water out of the inlet hose that leads up to the sea strainer and the seacock. To do this, I'm going to hook the hose to the output side of the shop vac, turn on the shop vac, and force air back out through the inlet. I open the seacock, look or listen for bubbles, and then close the seacock before turning off the shop vac. The seacock and inlet hose are now clear of water, so I proceed with winterizing the engine. I pour antifreeze into a bucket, then place the white snorkel hose into the gray shop vac insert and put the other end of the hose into the bucket. Next, I start the engine and watch the antifreeze level in the bucket go down as it's drawn into the engine. With antifreeze coming out of the exhaust, I hop down and snuff out the engine with 2 cans of fogging oil. With the engines winterized, I'll now move on to changing the fuel filters. I start by closing all the valves at the fuel manifold. Before opening any of the fuel filters, I'm going to turn on the blower, and then I'll mute that sound so you don't have to hear it throughout the video. I always start with a clean bucket so I can get a good look at the contents of the fuel filter, then I use a wrench to remove the drain plug from the bottom of the fuel canister. The T-handle at the top of the fuel filter is loosened so that the fuel drains faster. Once the fuel is drained, I unscrew the T-handle all the way from the top of the fuel filter and then pull off the lid. I want to make sure that the black O-ring comes along for the ride. I then pry out the paper filter element. The new paper element looks nice and clean. You can see it comes with 2 new gaskets, and you'll see this is a 10 micron filter, sufficient for these gas motors. The new filter slides down easily into place. Before putting the cap in place, you want to make sure that the black O-ring is securely seated into this groove. If it's not, it can either leak fuel, which is an obvious hazard, or it'll draw air and the engine won't run. This can be a tough one to diagnose. If this was a diesel engine, I would have pre-filled the filter housing just like I did the oil filter. This is because diesel engines can't process air like a gas engine can. The T-handle bolt also gets its own gasket before being screwed in place. Lastly, I install the drain plug back into the bottom of the filter housing. I like leaving the fuel filters empty during the winter. In the spring, when you go to grind the engine and start it, as the fuel canister fills with fuel, the engine is actually able to build oil pressure and circulate the oil before the engine starts. This boat's generator doesn't have an oil filter, so we'll skip the video portion of the oil change. You just draw out the old oil and then refill it with new oil. The generator's raw water flows from right to left in this shot. It comes in through the seacock, goes through the sea strainer, and then flows up into the engine. To winterize it, I start by closing the seacock, opening the sea strainer, and removing the strainer basket. I then set the sea flush reservoir in place on top of the sea strainer and secure it with the bungee cords. Since the boat is staying in the water this winter, I need to clear the water out of the intake hose and the seacock. I do this by using the output side of a shop vac and putting the hose down into the sea flush shop vac insert. I then open the valve and look or listen for bubbles outside of the boat. Then I close the seacock and turn off the shop vac. I unscrew the shop vac insert and then turn a gallon of antifreeze upside down into the sea flush reservoir. I know from previous experience that this generator only needs a gallon of antifreeze to be winterized. As the jug empties, I spray fogging oil into the carburetor while turning off the generator. With the winterizing complete, I reassemble the sea strainer so that it's ready for next year. The generator's fuel filter is a typical canister style. I simply unscrew the filter and pour the contents into a bucket. Before installing the new filter, I wipe a little motor oil onto the gaskets. This will help make the fuel filter easy to unscrew the next time I change it. I screw the filter in place and then secure it hand tight, just like an oil filter. With all the fluid changes complete, this is a good time to lay down new oil absorbent pads. This boat has one water inlet with a sea strainer and pump, which serve as 2 different air conditioners. After flowing through the air conditioners, the water is then discharged on the port side of the hull. Again, this boat will be winterized in the water, so we'll start by closing the seacock and unscrewing the sea strainer. Next, I remove the strainer basket and then use a shop vac to suck the water out of the sea strainer. With all the water out of the sea strainer, I then set the blue sea flush reservoir down on top of the sea strainer and secure it in place with the bungees. I then use the shop vac to blow air down into the system and back flush the inlet hose. This step can be skipped if the boat is staying on land. With the seacock closed, air is now forced downstream through the air conditioning pump and the individual air conditioners. All this is done without ever turning on the air conditioning. At this point, the system is mostly winterized, but to be sure, I'll use the shop vac to force a small amount of antifreeze down through the system. I pour antifreeze down through the gray shop vac insert, filling the insert and the sea strainer. Then insert the hose and turn on the shop vac to force the antifreeze through the system. The process is repeated until pink antifreeze can be seen coming from each of the 2 air conditioner discharges. This is how the antifreeze looks at the discharge in slow motion. At this point, we have visual confirmation that the air conditioning system is winterized. Initially, we saw the bubbles while clearing the intake hose leading up to the sea strainer. Lastly, we saw the pink antifreeze coming from the discharge ports of each of the 2 air conditioners. The last few steps are to remove the sea flush reservoir, insert the strainer basket, and secure the strainer lid. Before winterizing the head, you want to make sure that the holding tank has been pumped out. Otherwise, the waste itself could freeze and crack the holding tank. This boat does not have vacuum flush toilets, so the toilets actually flush by using raw water drawn in from the outside. Ironically, there's no sea flush method for winterizing a toilet, so I start by removing the hose clamp and pulling off the water inlet hose. Again, I'll use the output side of a shop vac hose to force air back out through the inlet, clearing the water. When the bubbles are coming out, I'll go down and close the intake valve. I then fight to reinstall the intake hose, secure it in place, and pour a gallon or 2 of antifreeze into the toilet. On a boat that holds 100 gallons of fresh water, has a hot water tank, 3 sinks, and 2 showers, there's a lot to winterize. The best technique I have found is to use a fitting like this to blow the lines clear through the dockside water inlet. This homemade fitting has an air chuck on the right side and then converts to fit the dockside water inlet on the left side. I start by turning on the water pressure and opening a faucet to drain the fresh water tank. I then screw the adapter into the dockside water inlet and connect the air hose. With the system pressurized, I open the drain on the hot water tank. Once all the water is drained out, I close the valve and move on to the faucets. I open each faucet valve and allow the water to purge from the lines. The same thing is done for the shower and the galley sink. With the lines clear, I pour a gallon of antifreeze into the fresh water tank and then turn on the pump to draw some antifreeze into the pump housing. The system is now winterized and I use just $4 in materials. This boat has canvas covers for the engine room air intakes. You'd be surprised how much heat is retained just by closing off these air vents. After recycling the oil and filters, don't forget to empty the refrigerator. If you found this video to be informative, please subscribe to Sea Flush Inc. on our YouTube page and check out our other videos with more boating content. Thanks for watching.